Sarah Martinez had always been the kind of person who ran toward danger instead of away from it. At 28, she worked as a paramedic in downtown Chicago, where every day brought new challenges and unexpected situations. Her colleagues often joked that she had ice water running through her veins, but Sarah knew the truth was different. She felt every heartbeat of fear, every moment of doubt, but she had learned to push through it because someone's life might depend on her actions. On that cold February morning, Sarah was finishing her shift when the call came through the radio. There had been an explosion at a construction site on the south side of the city. Multiple casualties were reported, and all available emergency personnel were being dispatched to the scene. Sarah's partner, Mike, was already grabbing their medical bags and heading toward the ambulance. The ride to the construction site took 12 minutes, but it felt like hours. As they approached the area, Sarah could see thick black smoke rising into the gray winter sky. The smell of burning metal and concrete filled the air, and she could hear shouting from several blocks away. When they arrived, the scene was chaos. Workers were running in different directions, some covered in dust and debris, others helping their injured colleagues away from the damaged building. The construction site had been working on a new apartment complex when a gas line ruptured and caused a massive explosion. Part of the building had collapsed, trapping several workers inside. The fire department was already on scene, working to control the flames and search for survivors. Police officers were trying to establish a safe perimeter and keep curious onlookers at a distance. Sarah and Mike quickly set up their medical station in a safe area about 50 yards from the damaged building. They began treating the workers who had made it out on their own, dealing with cuts, burns, and breathing problems from smoke inhalation. Most of the injuries were minor, but Sarah kept looking toward the collapsed section of the building, knowing that the people trapped inside would need help soon. As she bandaged a worker's burned arm, Sarah heard someone shouting from near the rubble. A young construction worker named Tommy was calling out that he could hear someone trapped underneath a fallen beam. The firefighters were still working to get their heavy equipment in position, but Tommy said the person underneath was getting weaker and might not have much time left. Sarah looked toward the collapsed area and made a decision that would change her life forever. She grabbed her medical bag and started walking toward the rubble, despite Mike's protest that it wasn't safe. The building was still unstable, and there was always a risk of another collapse or explosion. But Sarah had heard something in Tommy's voice that told her someone was in serious trouble, and every minute of delay could mean the difference between life and death. As she got closer to the collapsed section, Sarah could see the massive concrete beam that had fallen. Underneath it, she could barely make out the shape of a person trapped beneath the heavy debris. The man was conscious but clearly in severe pain. His leg was pinned under the beam and he was having trouble breathing. Sarah knelt down next to him and began her assessment. The trapped man introduced himself as James Rodriguez, a 25-year-old electrician who had been working on the building's wiring when the explosion happened. He had been thrown backward by the blast and ended up underneath the fallen beam. James was scared but trying to stay calm. He kept asking Sarah if she thought he was going to make it out alive. Sarah began working to stabilize James while they waited for the heavy equipment to arrive. She gave him oxygen to help with his breathing and started an IV to give him fluids and pain medication. She could tell that his leg was badly injured, possibly broken in multiple places, but she tried to keep him focused on staying conscious and breathing steadily. While Sarah worked, she could hear the firefighters coordinating their rescue efforts. The building was still dangerous and they needed to be very careful about how they removed the beam. If they moved it the wrong way, it could cause another collapse or shift other debris that might hurt James even more. The rescue operation was going to take time, and Sarah knew she needed to keep James stable until they could get him out safely. As Sarah continued treating James under the concrete beam, the situation around them grew more dangerous by the minute. The firefighters had discovered that the gas leak was larger than they initially thought, and there was still a risk of another explosion. The incident commander ordered everyone to move back to a safer distance, but Sarah refused to leave James behind. James was getting weaker despite Sarah's efforts to keep him stable. His blood pressure was dropping, and she suspected he might be bleeding internally from injuries they couldn't see. The pain medication was helping, but she could tell he was going into shock. His skin was getting pale and clammy, and he was having trouble staying focused on their conversation. The firefighters brought in their heaviest equipment to try to lift the concrete beam. but the first attempt failed. The beam was wedged against other pieces of debris, and lifting it from one end only made it press down harder on James's leg. They needed to approach it from a different angle, but that would take more time to set up, time that James might not have. Sarah radioed back to Mike and requested additional medical supplies. She needed more IV fluids, stronger pain medication, and equipment to help support James's breathing if his condition got worse. Mike wanted to bring the supplies to her, but the incident commander wouldn't let anyone else into the dangerous area around the collapsed building. Instead, the firefighters created a relay system to pass medical supplies to Sarah. They formed a human chain from the safe area to where she was treating James, carefully passing items from person to person. It was slower than having Mike there to help her, but it was the safest way to get what she needed while keeping other people out of danger. While waiting for the supplies to arrive, Sarah tried to keep James talking and alert. He told her about his family back in Mexico, how he had come to Chicago 3 years ago to find work and send money home to his parents and younger sister. He was engaged to a woman named Maria who worked at a local restaurant, and they were planning to get married in the spring. James also shared that he was scared, not just for himself but for his family. If something happened to him, they would lose the money he sent home every month. His parents were getting older and couldn't work as hard as they used to. His sister was in school and depended on his support to pay for her education. The weight of these responsibilities was almost as heavy as the concrete beam pressing down on his leg. Sarah assured James that they were going to get him out safely, but privately she was becoming more worried about his condition. His pulse was getting weaker and more rapid, clear signs that his body was struggling to cope with his injuries. She increased his IV fluid rate and gave him another dose of pain medication, but she knew these were only temporary measures. The firefighters made their second attempt to lift the beam using a different approach. They brought in hydraulic jacks and positioned them at multiple points along the concrete. This time they were able to lift the beam slightly, but not enough to pull James free. They needed to lift it several more inches, but the jacks weren't powerful enough to handle the weight. While the rescue crew regrouped and planned their next approach, Sarah noticed that James was becoming less responsive. He was still conscious, but his answers to her questions were getting slower and less clear. She checked his vital signs again and confirmed what she had feared. He was losing the battle against shock and internal bleeding. Sarah made a difficult decision. She radioed the incident commander and told him that James couldn't wait any longer for the heavy equipment. His medical condition was deteriorating too quickly, and they needed to try a different approach. She suggested that they use a combination of the jacks and manual lifting to create just enough space for her to pull James out from under the beam. The incident commander was reluctant to approve such a risky plan. If something went wrong during the manual lifting, the beam could come down even harder on James, or it could injure the firefighters who would be doing the lifting. But Sarah insisted that James would die if they waited any longer for the proper equipment to arrive. After a quick discussion with his team, the incident commander agreed to try Sarah's plan. 6 firefighters positioned themselves around the concrete beam, while the hydraulic jacks provided as much lift as possible. On Sarah's signal, they would all lift together while she pulled James to safety. They would only have a few seconds to complete the rescue before the weight of the beam became too much for the firefighters to handle. Sarah positioned herself next to James and explained what was about to happen. She told him that when she said now, he needed to help her as much as he could by pushing with his arms and his uninjured leg. James nodded weakly and said he understood. Sarah could see the fear in his eyes, but also a determination to survive and get back to his family. Sarah took a deep breath and looked at each of the 6 firefighters positioned around the concrete beam. She could see the strain on their faces as they prepared for what might be their only chance to save James. The hydraulic jacks were already providing as much lift as they could manage, but it still wasn't enough to free him completely. "On my count," Sarah called out, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her body. 3, 2, 1, now." The firefighters lifted with everything they had, their faces turning red from the effort. Sarah grabbed James under his arms and pulled with all her strength. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened. The beam seemed impossibly heavy and James barely moved. Then suddenly she felt him sliding toward her as the firefighters managed to lift the concrete just enough to create the space they needed. "Keep lifting," Sarah shouted as she continued pulling James away from the beam. His injured leg dragged behind him and she could hear him crying out in pain, but he was moving. Inch by inch, she pulled him away from the concrete trap that had held him for over an hour. Just as James's injured leg cleared the beam, the firefighters reached their limit. The massive piece of concrete crashed back down to the ground with a thunderous boom that echoed across the construction site. If Sarah had been even 5 seconds slower, James would have been crushed. Several of the firefighters collapsed to their knees, exhausted from the effort of holding up thousands of pounds of concrete. Sarah immediately began checking James's vital signs again. The rescue had been successful, but the movement had made his condition worse. His blood pressure was dangerously low and his pulse was becoming irregular. She could see that his injured leg was bleeding more heavily now that it was free from the pressure of the beam. Working quickly, Sarah applied pressure bandages to the worst of James's wounds and increased his IV fluid rate again. She gave him a strong dose of pain medication and called for immediate transport to the nearest trauma center. James was conscious but barely responsive now, his body shutting down from the combination of blood loss, shock, and pain. Mike finally received permission to enter the area and help with James's care. Together, he and Sarah carefully moved James onto a stretcher and began carrying him toward their ambulance. The walk across the debris-covered construction site was treacherous, and they had to move slowly to avoid stumbling or dropping the stretcher. As they made their way across the site, Sarah began to feel strange. The adrenaline that had kept her focused and energized during the rescue was starting to wear off, and she was becoming aware of how exhausted she was. Her hands were shaking and she was having trouble catching her breath. She had been so focused on saving James that she hadn't noticed the toll the rescue had taken on her own body. Halfway to the ambulance, Sarah stumbled and nearly fell. Mike caught her arm and asked if she was okay, but Sarah insisted they needed to keep moving. James's condition was critical, and every minute of delay reduced his chances of survival. She forced herself to keep walking despite the growing weakness in her legs and the dizziness that was making it hard to see clearly. When they reached the ambulance, Mike helped load James into the back while Sarah climbed in to continue monitoring his condition. As Mike started the engine and pulled away from the construction site, Sarah began preparing James for the trip to the hospital. She needed to establish another IV line, check his breathing, and monitor his heart rhythm on the cardiac monitor. But as Sarah reached for the IV supplies, the world around her began to spin. The inside of the ambulance seemed to tilt and sway, and she had to grab the rail on the stretcher to keep from falling over. Mike was talking to her through the communication window between the front and back of the ambulance, but his voice sounded far away and distorted. Sarah tried to tell Mike that something was wrong, but when she opened her mouth to speak, no words came out. The dizziness was getting worse and dark spots were appearing at the edges of her vision. She looked down at James, who was still unconscious on the stretcher, and realized she might not be able to take care of him for the rest of the trip. The last thing Sarah remembered was reaching for the radio to call the hospital and warn them about James's critical condition. She wanted to make sure they would be ready for him when the ambulance arrived, with the trauma team standing by and the operating room prepared. But as she grabbed the radio handset, everything went black. Mike realized something was wrong when Sarah stopped responding to his questions about James's condition. He looked in his rearview mirror and saw that she had collapsed onto the floor of the ambulance. Now he had 2 patients instead of 1, and they were still several minutes away from the hospital. He radioed ahead to let them know they would need 2 teams ready when they arrived. The ambulance pulled into the emergency department with its lights flashing and sirens blaring. The trauma team was waiting outside, ready to take both James and Sarah into the hospital. As they wheeled James toward the operating room, another team of doctors began examining Sarah to figure out why she had lost consciousness during the rescue. Sarah woke up in a hospital bed with bright lights shining down on her, and the steady beeping of medical monitors filling the room. For a moment she was confused about where she was and what had happened. Then the memories came flooding back. The construction site explosion, James trapped under the concrete beam, and the desperate rescue effort that had saved his life. Dr. Amanda Chen, the emergency room physician who had been treating Sarah, noticed that she was awake and came over to check on her. Dr. Chen explained that Sarah had collapsed from a combination of exhaustion, dehydration, and something called adrenaline crash. She had pushed her body far beyond its normal limits during the rescue, and when the emergency was over, her system had simply shut down to protect itself. "You've been unconscious for about 6 hours," Dr. Chen told her gently. "Your body needed time to recover from what you went through today. The good news is that all of your tests came back normal. You're going to be fine with some rest and proper nutrition." Sarah's first question was about James. She needed to know if he had survived the trip to the hospital and whether the doctors had been able to save his leg. Dr. Chen smiled and told her that James was alive and stable. He had required emergency surgery to repair internal bleeding and to set the multiple fractures in his leg, but the surgeons were optimistic about his recovery. As word spread through the hospital about Sarah's heroic rescue of James, doctors and nurses began stopping by her room to congratulate her. They had all heard the story of how she had refused to leave a trapped victim behind, even when the building was unstable and dangerous. Many of them said they weren't sure they would have been brave enough to do what she had done. Sarah felt embarrassed by all the attention. In her mind, she had just been doing her job as a paramedic. When someone was injured and needed help, you helped them. It didn't matter if the situation was dangerous or if it meant putting yourself at risk. That was what she had signed up for when she chose to become a first responder. But Dr. Chen explained that what Sarah had done went far beyond the normal duties of a paramedic. Most emergency medical personnel would have waited for the fire department to extract the victim before providing treatment. Sarah had crawled into an unstable building, stayed with a critically injured patient for over an hour in dangerous conditions, and then helped carry out a risky rescue when conventional methods weren't working fast enough. While Sarah was recovering in the hospital, news of her actions was spreading far beyond the medical community. A local television reporter had heard about the rescue from one of the firefighters at the scene and wanted to do a story about Sarah's bravery. The reporter contacted the hospital and asked if she could interview Sarah about what had happened. At first, Sarah declined the interview request. She didn't want to be on television talking about herself, and she was worried that too much media attention might make her fellow paramedics think she was trying to show off or make them look bad. But Mike, her partner, convinced her that the story might inspire other people to help their neighbors in times of need. The television interview was brief, with Sarah downplaying her role in the rescue and emphasizing the teamwork of all the first responders who had been involved. She talked about James and his family, and how important it was that he had survived to continue supporting his parents and sister back in Mexico. The reporter asked her if she had been scared during the rescue, and Sarah admitted that she had been terrified, but that James's life had been more important than her fear. When the news story aired that evening, it caught the attention of viewers across the country. The video of Sarah describing the rescue, combined with footage from the construction site and interviews with the firefighters who had helped lift the concrete beam, created a powerful story of courage and selflessness that resonated with people everywhere. What Sarah didn't know was that the news story had also been seen by members of the United States Marine Corps. Several Marines stationed at the nearby Great Lakes Naval Training Center had watched the broadcast and were deeply impressed by Sarah's actions. In the Marine Corps, the concept of leave no one behind is a fundamental principle, and Sarah's refusal to abandon James under dangerous conditions embodied that same spirit. Captain Robert Williams, the commanding officer at Great Lakes, decided that Sarah's heroism deserved special recognition. He began making phone calls to coordinate a surprise tribute that would honor Sarah's bravery and show the community's appreciation for her selfless actions. Captain Williams had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and had seen many acts of courage, but Sarah's story reminded him of the best qualities he had witnessed in combat: the willingness to risk everything to save a fellow human being. The Marine Corps tribute was planned in secret. Over the next several days, while Sarah continued her recovery at home, she had been discharged from the hospital after 24 hours of observation, with instructions to rest for a week before returning to work. Sarah was grateful for the time off, but she was also eager to get back to her job as a paramedic. Helping people was what gave her life meaning, and she felt restless when she wasn't working. During her recovery week, Sarah received dozens of cards and letters from people who had seen her story on the news. Children from local schools had drawn pictures of her rescue, and their teachers had written to tell her that they were using her story as an example of citizenship and courage. Several people offered to donate money to help with any medical expenses she might have incurred, though Sarah politely declined their generous offers. On a sunny Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after the construction site rescue, Sarah was at home catching up on laundry when she heard the sound of vehicles pulling up outside her apartment building. She looked out her window and was surprised to see several military vehicles parked on the street below. Soldiers in dress uniforms were getting out of the vehicles and forming up in neat rows. Sarah thought perhaps there was some kind of military ceremony happening in the neighborhood, but she couldn't imagine why it would be taking place on her quiet residential street. She continued folding clothes while keeping an eye on the activity outside. More vehicles arrived, and she counted what appeared to be several dozen Marines in their formal dress blue uniforms. A few minutes later, there was a knock at Sarah's front door. When she opened it, she found Captain Williams standing on her doorstep along with 2 other Marine officers. Captain Williams introduced himself and explained that he and his Marines had come to honor her for the courage she had shown during the construction site rescue. Sarah was completely shocked. She had never expected anything like this, and she wasn't sure why the Marine Corps would be interested in what she had done. Captain Williams explained that Marines have a sacred commitment to never leave a fallen comrade behind, and Sarah's refusal to abandon James under dangerous conditions embodied that same principle. Her actions had earned the respect and admiration of every Marine who had heard her story. Captain Williams asked Sarah if she would be willing to come outside so that his Marines could properly honor her. Sarah was nervous about being the center of attention, but she was also deeply moved by the gesture. She had always had tremendous respect for the military and the sacrifices that service members made for their country. To be recognized by Marines was an honor she had never imagined receiving. When Sarah stepped outside her apartment building, she gasped at the sight before her. 500 Marines were standing in perfect formation in the street and on the sidewalks surrounding her building. They were all wearing their dress blue uniforms, and their polished buttons and insignia gleamed in the morning sunlight. The precision and discipline of their formation was breathtaking. As Sarah walked toward the center of the formation, the Marines stood at attention with military precision. The silence was profound, broken only by the sound of Sarah's footsteps on the pavement and the distant noise of traffic from the main road several blocks away. She felt overwhelmed by the solemnity and dignity of the moment. Captain Williams positioned himself next to Sarah and began to speak to the assembled Marines. His voice carried clearly across the formation as he told the story of Sarah's heroic actions at the construction site. He described how she had risked her own life to save a stranger, staying with him under dangerous conditions and refusing to give up even when conventional rescue methods weren't working. This civilian exemplifies the values we hold most dear as Marines, Captain Williams announced. Courage, commitment, and the unwavering determination to leave no one behind. Her actions under fire demonstrate the same spirit that has made our Corps strong for over 200 years. At Captain Williams's command, all 500 Marines executed a perfect hand salute in Sarah's honor. The movement was so synchronized that it sounded like a single snap as their hands came up to their foreheads. The sight of 500 warriors paying tribute to her selfless actions brought tears to Sarah's eyes. Sarah had never been saluted before, and she wasn't sure how to respond. Captain Williams quietly told her that she didn't need to salute back, but that she could simply nod her acknowledgement of their tribute. As Sarah looked out over the sea of Marines standing in her honor, she felt a profound sense of humility and gratitude. The salute lasted for 30 seconds, which felt like an eternity to Sarah. When Captain Williams finally gave the command for the Marines to lower their hands, the silence returned. He then presented Sarah with a certificate of appreciation from the Marine Corps, along with a flag that had been flown over Marine Corps headquarters in Washington, D.C. in her honor. As the formal ceremony concluded, individual Marines began approaching Sarah to shake her hand and thank her personally. Many of them told her that her story had reminded them why they had chosen to serve their country. Some shared stories of their own experiences in combat, where they had witnessed similar acts of courage and selflessness. One young Marine named Corporal Jackson told Sarah that he had been struggling with some personal problems and was considering leaving the Marine Corps when he heard her story on the news. Her example had reminded him that service to others was bigger than any personal challenges he might be facing, and he had decided to re-enlist for another 4 years. Another Marine, Sergeant Martinez, told Sarah that his own sister was a paramedic in Texas, and that hearing about Sarah's heroism had given him a new appreciation for the risks that first responders take every day. He said he was going to call his sister that evening to thank her for her service. something he had never thought to do before. The gathering lasted for about an hour, with Marines continuing to approach Sarah throughout the event. She was amazed by their politeness and professionalism, and by the genuine warmth and respect they showed her. Many of them took photos with her, saying they wanted to show their families back home the civilian hero they had come to honor. As the Marines began to depart, Captain Williams told Sarah that she would always be considered an honorary member of the Marine Corps family. He gave her his personal contact information and told her that if she ever needed anything, she should not hesitate to call. The Marines had adopted her as one of their own, and they would always be there to support her just as she had supported James in his time of greatest need. In the weeks following the Marine Corps tribute, Sarah's life changed in ways she never could have anticipated. The story of the tribute itself had been covered by national news outlets, and suddenly she found herself receiving invitations to speak at schools, community organizations, and first responder training academies across the country. People wanted to hear her story and learn from her example of selfless service. At first, Sarah was reluctant to accept these speaking engagements. She still felt uncomfortable with all the attention and worried that people were making too big a deal out of what she had done. But as she began to meet with groups and share her story, she realized that her experience was inspiring others to think about how they could help their communities in times of need. During one particularly memorable visit to a middle school, a 12-year-old student named Emma asked Sarah what advice she would give to young people who wanted to help others, but didn't think they were brave enough. Sarah thought carefully about the question, and then told Emma that courage wasn't about not being scared. It was about doing the right thing even when you were afraid. "I was terrified during that rescue," Sarah admitted to the students. "My hands were shaking and I wasn't sure if we would be able to get James out alive. But I knew that if I didn't try to help him, he would definitely die. Sometimes being brave just means taking one small step forward, even when you're scared." Sarah also made a point of visiting James during his recovery. He had undergone multiple surgeries to repair his leg, and would need months of physical therapy to regain full mobility. But the doctors were confident that he would eventually make a complete recovery. James was overwhelmed with gratitude when he learned about everything that had happened after his rescue, particularly the Marine Corps tribute. "I can't believe that 500 Marines came to honor you because of what you did for me," James told Sarah during one of her visits. "I'm just a construction worker from Mexico. I never thought that my life was important enough for something like that to happen." Sarah explained to James that every life was precious and worth saving, regardless of someone's job or background. The Marines had honored her not because James was particularly important or famous, but because helping people in need was always the right thing to do. She hoped that when James recovered fully, he would remember this lesson and look for opportunities to help others in his community. The story of Sarah's rescue and the Marine tribute had also reached James's family back in Mexico. His parents and sister had been following the news coverage closely, and they wanted to express their gratitude to Sarah for saving their son and brother. James's sister had written a letter in Spanish that James translated for Sarah during one of her visits. "She says that you are an angel sent by God to protect our family," James translated, his eyes filling with tears. "She says that because of what you did, I will be able to walk her down the aisle when she gets married next year, and our parents will have their son home with them for many more years. She wants to name her first daughter Sarah, in your honor." The letter from James's sister moved Sarah deeply, reminding her of why she had chosen to become a paramedic in the first place. It wasn't about the recognition or praise. It was about being able to make a difference in people's lives during their most vulnerable moments. Every person she helped had a family who loved them, dreams they wanted to pursue, and contributions they wanted to make to their community. As the months passed, Sarah returned to her regular duties as a paramedic, but she found that her perspective on her work had changed. The Marine Corps tribute had reminded her that what she did every day was not just a job, but a calling to serve others. She approached each emergency call with renewed purpose, knowing that her actions could have far-reaching effects on the lives of the people she helped and their families. Sarah also began volunteering with organizations that trained civilian first responders and emergency preparedness volunteers. She wanted to share the skills and knowledge she had gained over her career with people who might find themselves in situations where they could help save lives. The construction site rescue had shown her that ordinary people were capable of extraordinary things when they were properly prepared and motivated by compassion for others. The certificate and flag that the Marines had given Sarah held places of honor in her apartment, serving as daily reminders of the values that guided her work. But the most meaningful reminder of that day was a photo that Corporal Jackson had sent her several months later. It showed him graduating from advanced leadership training, with a note explaining that Sarah's example had motivated him to become the best Marine he could be. Years later, when people asked Sarah about the most important moment of her career, she would tell them about waking up in that hospital bed and learning that both she and James had survived their ordeal. The Marine Corps tribute had been an incredible honor, but the real reward was knowing that James had returned to his family and continued building the life he had dreamed of when he came to America. Sarah's story became a lasting reminder that heroism doesn't require special powers or extraordinary circumstances. Sometimes it just requires an ordinary person who decides that helping someone else is more important than their own safety. In a world that often seemed divided by differences, Sarah's actions had shown that compassion and courage could bring people together across all boundaries of background, culture, and experience. The 500 Marines who had saluted her that day understood that some values are universal, and that true heroism is measured not by the recognition it receives, but by the lives it touches and the inspiration it provides for others to serve.